The last breath and the first sight. Ethan never thought much about death. He was only 13, and death was something that happened to old people in hospitals, not to kids who had barely figured out algebra. His biggest worries were school, video games, and why his older brother, Jason, always took the last slice of pizza. But life, as he knew it, ended in an instant. It had been a normal afternoon, warm, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of freshly cut grass. Ethan was walking home from school, earbuds blasting his favorite playlist, his mind drifting between thoughts of the science test he probably failed and the game he couldn't wait to play when he got home. The crosswalk light flashed red, but Ethan had done this a million times. No cars were coming, so he stepped into the street. Then came the sound. The screech of tires. The deafening honk. The blur of something big, fast, and deadly. Pain. For the briefest moment, pain like nothing he had ever felt. Then, nothing. Darkness swallowed him whole. No sound, no light, no thoughts. Just an emptiness so deep it felt like he had never existed at all. And then, light. Not the kind of light that comes from the sun or a lamp. This was something more. It was everywhere, all around him, inside him. It was alive, warm, powerful. It didn't just shine, it spoke. Ethan tried to move, but he had no body. He was just there, suspended in an ocean of radiance. Yet, somehow, he wasn't afraid. Then, a voice, strong yet gentle, mighty yet loving. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Ethan. The moment he heard his name, something inside him shook. He knew this voice. He had never heard it before, yet it had been with him his whole life. It was the voice that had whispered to his heart when he cried alone in his room. The voice that had stirred in the wind on quiet mornings. Ethan, the voice said again, it is not your time. But listen carefully, because you must tell them what I show you. Tell who? About what? Before Ethan could ask, the light around him intensified, wrapping around him like a force beyond time. Then, he was pulled, not like falling, not like flying. It was as if his very soul was being transported by an unseen hand. The light around him faded, and suddenly, he wasn't nowhere anymore. He was somewhere, and what he saw next made his heart pound. The shaking earth and the unseen war. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. One moment, he had been floating in an endless sea of light, consumed by the warmth and presence of the voice. Now he was somewhere else, everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The ground beneath him wasn't solid, yet he felt like he was standing. The air around him wasn't air at all, but something heavier, almost alive. A strange energy pulsed in the space around him, a mixture of peace and intensity, like standing at the edge of a massive storm, knowing it could consume everything yet feeling no fear. Then Ethan looked down, and his heart nearly stopped. Below him was Earth, but not like he had ever seen it before. The entire planet shook, not just in one place, not like a single earthquake, but everywhere, all at once. Mountains cracked and crumbled into dust. Oceans swirled with waves higher than skyscrapers. Cities that should have been glowing with life flickered in and out of darkness. It was chaos. It was destruction. It was war. Ethan's hands clenched into fists, except he didn't have hands. He wasn't in his body anymore, but he still felt everything. The screams, the cries, the raw fear of the people below him echoed inside his soul. What is happening? Ethan whispered, barely able to form the words. Then he realized he wasn't alone. Jesus stood beside him. Not the Jesus from paintings, not the soft, delicate figure from Sunday school books. This Jesus was different. His presence was overwhelming, stronger than the brightest sun, more solid than the hardest stone. His eyes weren't just looking at Ethan. They were looking through him, seeing every thought, every doubt, every hidden fear. Yet there was no condemnation in those eyes. Only power, only truth. Ethan swallowed hard. What is this? Why is everything falling apart? Jesus gazed at the earth below, his face unreadable. What you see is the shaking. Ethan frowned. Shaking. Jesus nodded. A battle has begun. A battle that has been raging for longer than men can remember. But now, the time has come for the world to see it. Ethan turned his eyes back to the planet. He could feel the battle even though he couldn't see it clearly. It wasn't just earthquakes and storms. There was something deeper happening. Then he saw them. Dark shadows slithered through the destruction. They weren't made of flesh and blood. They weren't human. But they moved through the cities, whispering lies, twisting hearts, turning people against one another. Ethan's stomach turned. Who? What are they? Jesus' voice was steady. Deception. Lies. Spirits of confusion, fear, division. Ethan's eyes widened as he watched people below. Some were running, crying, hiding. But others were blind. They walked as if nothing was wrong, as if they couldn't see the destruction around them. Their eyes were empty, their faces blank. Some were laughing, celebrating, mocking those who cried for help. Ethan's chest tightened. Why can't they see what's happening? Why don't they run? Jesus turned his gaze toward him. Because they do not want to see. Their hearts have chosen comfort over truth, darkness over light. But the time has come for truth to shine, and for my people to rise. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He still didn't fully understand, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about natural disasters or political struggles. This was bigger. A war, Ethan whispered. This is a war. Jesus nodded. Yes, and the battle is not just for nations. It is for hearts. Ethan felt a chill run through him. This war wasn't fought with weapons. It wasn't between armies. It was something else, something deeper. He turned to Jesus. But how does it end? Who wins? Jesus smiled, a smile that wasn't just reassurance, but a promise. The truth always wins. But first, the world must awaken. Ethan took a deep breath. His mind was still spinning, but before he could speak again, the ground beneath him shifted. The scene below him changed. He was no longer watching the destruction. He was in a place of power. And before him stood a man the world thought was finished, a leader whose mission was not yet over. And with that, the vision pulled Ethan forward, into something he never could have expected. The unfinished mission and the gathering storm. Ethan felt the world shift around him again. The great battlefield faded, replaced by something new, something bigger. Now he stood in a vast chamber, not of stone or glass, but of something beyond human comprehension. It was not bound by walls, nor was it suspended in endless space. It simply was. The presence of the throne remained, towering, eternal. But now multitudes stood before it. Ethan gasped. Men and women, figures both known and unknown, stood in ranks upon ranks, stretching into eternity. Some wore crowns, some carried scrolls, others were clad in simple robes. Yet each one bore an air of authority. These were rulers, judges, witnesses, and at the very front of them all, a man knelt. Ethan's heart clenched. He recognized him instantly. The leader, the one the world had judged, the one they had declared finished. Ethan had heard so many things about him, that he was a warrior, that he was a fraud, that he was a savior, that he was a tyrant, that he stood for truth, that he was the cause of division. Yet here he was, not standing on a stage before cameras, not in front of a crowd of cheering or jeering people, but kneeling before the throne. And he was listening. Ethan turned to Jesus, who stood beside him, radiant and unshaken. His presence filled the space with something beyond power, something that commanded all things. Ethan swallowed. What's happening? What is he doing here? I thought he was finished. Jesus' gaze remained fixed on the kneeling man, his voice steady as eternity itself. filled the air. The world has declared many things, but the will of men does not determine the will of God. Ethan's breath hitched. The chamber was silent, yet something was being spoken, not in human words, but in something deeper. The leader, still on his knees, remained still, his hands clenched into fists, his shoulders tense. But then, something changed. A wind swept through the chamber, not a breeze, but a presence. It carried weight. It carried decision. The leader's head lifted. His expression was unreadable, one of determination, of realization, of resolve. Then, for the first time, he spoke. "I understand. I am ready." Ethan shivered. Ready for what? Before he could ask, Jesus raised a hand. And in an instant, the vision shifted. The gathering storm. Ethan now stood above the earth again. But it was different. Where before he had seen chaos, earthquakes, storms, division, now he saw something rising. At first, it was subtle. A stirring, a whisper, a movement beneath the surface. People, ordinary people, from cities, from farmlands, from places of power and places of poverty, waking up. Ethan saw them rising. Some alone, some in small groups, some in great numbers. Their eyes were opening. Their voices were strengthening. And then, the storm came. Not of rain, not of wind, but of clash. Truth against deception. Light against darkness. Awakening against blindness. Ethan saw nations trembling. He saw people who had mocked, who had laughed, who had dismissed the shaking as nothing more than politics or fate, now gripped with confusion and fear. And at the center of it all, he saw the leader again. But he was not alone. He stood, not as a man returning to power for his own sake, but as one who had been sent. A mission had been given to him, and it had not yet been completed. Ethan turned to Jesus, his heart racing. "What is this? What am I seeing?" Jesus looked at him, into him. And then he spoke words that would be burned into Ethan's soul forever. What has been stolen must be restored. What was silenced must be heard. The time of reckoning is near, and the world is not ready. The words shook Ethan's very spirit. This wasn't about politics. It wasn't about opinions. This was about something greater, something divine. And before Ethan could even take a breath, the vision changed again. Something far greater was coming. And Ethan knew this was only the beginning, the reckoning and the rising. Ethan barely had time to process what he had just seen before the world shifted again. The trembling earth faded from his view, and suddenly he was standing somewhere else. At first, he thought it was back in the grand chamber. But no, this place was different. It was vast, stretching beyond the limits of his sight. Yet it had no walls, no ceiling. The air was thick, not with mist or smoke, but with weight, an invisible force pressing against everything. Before him stood two great armies, one on the left, one on the right. But this wasn't a battle of men in armor. This wasn't a war of flesh and blood. The army on the left was clothed in shadows, figures wrapped in deception, their eyes hollow, their words sharp like daggers. Ethan could hear their whispers, slithering through the air like serpents. "It is over. The people are blind. The world is ours." And on the right, the army stood strong. They were clothed in light, not blinding, but unyielding. Their weapons were not swords or shields, but truth. They carried no banners, no names, no personal glory, only purpose. Between them, a great divide. And standing in the middle, just on the edge of the light, was the leader. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had seen him kneel before the throne. He had heard the decision being spoken, even if he hadn't understood it. But now, here he stood, at the center of the reckoning. His face was set, his hands were clenched. He was looking straight ahead, unmoved by the voices on either side. Yet Ethan could see the struggle within him. The whispers from the left side pressed in, slithering around him like chains. You cannot return. They will not accept you. They will betray you again. You are finished. Your time is over. Do not rise." Ethan turned to Jesus, standing beside him. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with knowing. Ethan swallowed. "What's happening? Why is he here?" Jesus answered, his voice like the rolling of thunder and the whisper of a breeze all at once. "A choice is before him. He must rise, or the world will fall." Ethan felt his heart pound. The leader was wavering. Not in fear, but in burden. The weight of what lay before him was unlike anything he had carried before. Ethan wanted to shout, to tell him to move, to step forward, to ignore the voices pulling him down. But then, from the army of light, a voice rose. It was not loud, it was not forceful, but it was clear. "Stand." Ethan turned his head. The army of light stood firm, their faces filled with determination. They did not shout. They did not beg. They only called, "Stand." And then, something happened. The leader moved. One step. Just one. But the moment his foot touched the ground before him, the darkness shook. The whispers turned to screams. The shadows recoiled. The chains broke. And from the army of light, a great wind rushed forth. It swept over the leader, over the divide, pushing against the darkness like a storm reclaiming what had been stolen. Ethan gasped. "What's happening?" Jesus' voice was steady. "The time of deception is ending. Truth must rise. The return and the great shaking." Ethan was pulled again, this time, back to earth. But the world was not as he had last seen it. Something was different. The people were different. Some were cheering. Some were weeping. Some were furious. Some stood frozen, unable to process what was happening before their eyes. Ethan turned his gaze, and there he saw it, the return. The leader had stepped forward, and the world was not ready for it. Ethan could hear voices rising from every corner of the earth, news stations frantically trying to explain, politicians scrambling to respond, people caught between belief and disbelief. Some rejoiced, saying, "This is justice." Others raged, crying out, "This is a lie." But it didn't matter, because the storm had begun. Ethan's eyes widened as he saw a great shaking overtake the nations. Not just in governments, not just in power structures, but in the very souls of people. It was as if a veil had been ripped in two. Some saw light, others clung to the shadows. And then, Ethan saw something that made his blood run cold. Beyond the cities, beyond the capitals, beyond the crowds of confused and rejoicing people, there was movement. In the darkness, a gathering, a rising. They were not happy. The unseen forces that had whispered in the halls of power, that had twisted truth, that had sown deception across the earth, they were not done. The battle had only just begun. Ethan turned to Jesus in alarm. "It's not over, is it? Even after everything, they won't stop." Jesus looked at him, and there was both sorrow and certainty in his gaze. Truth has risen, but now the war for men's hearts begins. Ethan swallowed hard. He had thought the vision was about a single event, a moment in time. But now he understood. This was bigger. This wasn't just about a leader. It was about the battle between truth and deception, between light and darkness, between those who would see and those who refused. And as he looked upon the world, shaking in the wake of the return, he knew something even greater was coming. And the world was not ready for it. The unveiling and the last warning. Ethan barely had time to think before the vision shifted again. The world, which had been in chaos just moments ago, now blurred into something new. The shaking cities, the divided people, the storm of voices, all of it faded, like mist before a rising sun. And suddenly, he was somewhere higher, not just above the earth, but beyond it. It was as if he stood at the very edge of time itself, staring down at the unfolding climax of human history. And what he saw next would haunt him forever. the shadow that moved. Far below, Ethan saw the world. Small, fragile, spinning in the vastness of space. But it was no longer the same Earth he had once known. Something dark was moving across it. Not a storm. Not a shadow cast by the turning of the sun. Something deeper. Something alive. It slithered across nations, weaving through streets, creeping into homes, seeping into the hearts and minds of people. And wherever it touched, truth became twisted. Right became wrong. Darkness disguised itself as light. Ethan shivered. He could feel it, even from up here. This wasn't just deception. This was a lie so great, so powerful, that even those who had once seen the truth were beginning to doubt. He turned to Jesus, who stood beside him, his expression unreadable. "What is this?" Ethan asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Jesus gazed down at the world. His eyes, burning with something far beyond human understanding, held both sorrow and certainty. It is the last deception, the final great lie. Ethan swallowed hard, but they saw the truth. The leader returned. People woke up. How can they still be deceived? Jesus turned his gaze upon him, and the weight of that look nearly crushed Ethan's soul. Because the world does not love truth. It loves comfort, and the lie will offer them what they desire. Ethan felt a chill run through him. It made sense now. The battle wasn't just about the leader. It wasn't just about governments or politics or nations. It was about the hearts of men. Even when truth stood before them, many would choose the lie, because the lie was easier. The lie would tell them they were right. The lie would tell them they didn't need to change. The lie would promise them peace while secretly chaining them in darkness. And then Ethan saw something worse. Beyond the creeping shadow, beyond the whispering deception, there were those who saw it for what it was. There were those who knew the truth, but they were afraid to speak. Ethan watched in horror as men and women, some in positions of power, some in the streets, some even in churches, stood silent while the lie spread like wildfire. They saw, but they did nothing. And in their silence, the darkness grew. Ethan turned back to Jesus, panic rising in his chest. What do we do? How do we stop this? Jesus' gaze hardened. And then he spoke words that thundered through Ethan's very soul. I have already given them the truth, but they must choose to speak it or be consumed. The final warning. Ethan suddenly found himself falling. The world rushed toward him, and in the blink of an eye, he was back on earth. But now he stood in the middle of a crowd. People of all kinds surrounded him, young and old, rich and poor, leaders and followers. They were arguing, their voices rising in confusion and anger. It's a lie. The leader is a fraud. No, he was sent back for a reason. Can't you see? The news says, the prophets warned us. The world is changing. This isn't normal. Ethan's head spun. They weren't listening to each other. They were dividing. And then, the ground shook, a deep, resonating tremor that seemed to come from within the earth itself. People screamed, clutching onto whatever they could find. Buildings trembled. The sky darkened. And then, a voice, louder than any thunder, split the heavens. Choose this day VUMUYLCRV. Ethan fell to his knees. That voice. It wasn't coming from a man. It wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from within their souls. It was the final warning. And every single person heard it. Some fell to their knees, weeping. Some ran, fleeing not from danger, but from the truth they didn't want to face. Some stood frozen, unable to decide. And then, Ethan saw the leaders. Not just the one who had returned, but others, the ones who had remained silent. Some stepped forward. Others turned away. And in that moment, Ethan knew. The world had reached its final choice. The time of hiding was over. The time of choosing had come. And those who refused to stand for truth would be swept away in the storm to come. The beginning of the end. Ethan turned to Jesus, tears burning in his eyes. What happens now? Jesus looked at him with a sadness deeper than eternity. Now they must stand, or they will fall. Ethan's heart ached. He wanted to cry out, to beg the people to wake up, to see, to understand. But he knew now. They had already been shown. They had already been warned. Now, the choice was theirs, and the world would never be the same again. The last stand and the great awakening. Ethan's heart pounded as the weight of Jesus' words settled over him. Now, they must stand, or they will fall. He could still hear the echo of that divine voice rolling across the earth. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a plea. It was a final call, a line drawn in eternity itself. And as the voice faded, the world held its breath. For one fragile, fleeting moment, everything stood still. The two divides. Then, the world split. Not by war, not by borders, not even by politics, but by truth. Ethan watched in shock as people divided, not into countries, not into parties, not even into religions, but into those who saw, and those who refused to see. And as they chose, something terrifying happened. The shadow, the one Ethan had seen slithering across the world, began to take shape. What had once been a formless, creeping darkness rose into something vast, something monstrous, something that no longer needed to hide. It was every lie made manifest. It stood over the earth like a towering storm, shifting, writhing, feeding on the fear, the confusion, the silence of those who refused to stand for truth. Ethan could hear it, a whisper so low, so smooth, it almost sounded kind. All will be well. There is nothing to fear. The one who has returned is not your salvation. He it is your enemy. Trust us. Ethan looked down, and his blood ran cold. People were believing it. Even those who had once rejoiced in the leader's return, even those who had once seen the truth, they were giving in. One by one, they lowered their heads. One by one, they stepped into the shadow. And as they did, their eyes changed. They became empty, not filled with hate, not filled with rage, just nothing. It was the most terrifying thing Ethan had ever seen. And then he saw the others, the ones who refused to bow. They were few, so few that Ethan's heart nearly broke. Men and women, young and old, leaders and laborers, rich and poor. And they were standing, not fighting, not arguing, just standing. Their faces lifted toward heaven, their hearts unshaken, their voices silent, yet louder than any thunder. And at that moment, the storm of deception hesitated. It did not falter. It did not fall. But it hesitated. And Ethan understood. This was not a war of swords. This was not a battle of armies. It was a battle of wills. Would the people of truth stand, no matter the cost? Or would they, in fear, bow to the lie? Ethan turned to Jesus, desperate for an answer. Will they win? Jesus' eyes, eternal, knowing, held both sorrow and victory. They have already won, but they must endure the shaking and the reckoning. Then, the ground roared. It was not an earthquake. It was something deeper, a shaking that came from the very soul of creation. Ethan saw mountains tremble, cities crumble, not in destruction, but in purification. The false things, those built on greed, on corruption, on deception, collapsed, not by war, not by fire, but by truth. What was real remained. What was false was wiped away. Ethan saw the leaders. Some, who had once been silent, fell to their knees. And the moment they did, their chains broke. Others, who had embraced the lie, vanished into the shadow. And then, the sky opened, not with fire, not with wrath, but with light. The awakening and the return. Ethan felt something change. The world, which had been breaking, now began to heal. Those who had stood for truth, they rose, stronger, brighter, unshaken, and as the shadow shrieked, as it recoiled, Ethan knew it had lost, not because it had been defeated by force, not because it had been cast down by angels, but because the people had refused to bow. The storm collapsed, the sky cleared, and standing among them, in the very heart of it all, the leader returned, restored, unmoved, and beside him, something greater, a presence so powerful, so undeniable, that Ethan felt his very soul bend in awe. And he knew it was over. The time of choosing had passed, and the great awakening had begun. The final words. Ethan felt his body being pulled back. Faster, higher, brighter. Until he was standing once more in the presence of Jesus. His mind was spinning. His heart raced. But Jesus looked at him with the calmness of eternity itself. Ethan swallowed. What happens now? Jesus smiled. Not a smile of ease, but of certainty, of victory. Now, you must tell them, for the time is near. And in an instant, Ethan woke up, back in his body. He gasped, his lungs desperate for air. His heart pounded in his chest. The beeping of hospital monitors filled his ears. A nurse shouted for a doctor. His mother's sobs turned to cries of joy. He was alive. But he knew. He had not simply returned. He had been sent back. And he had a message to deliver. Because the world was standing on the edge of history. And soon, everything would change.